Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our morning coffee time for Thursday, September the 3rd. How is everyone this morning? Let's see, we have 38 people starting off, so missing a few people. How is everything looking and sounding to people this morning? Okay, I see a few signs that everything is good. So let's see. I don't have much in the way of news today. Not all that much has changed from yesterday, though. I'm a day older. And as some wise Englishman once said, shorter of breath and one day closer to death. Oh yes, Dan noticed I got a haircut. So yesterday was our lunar observance day, the Opposita day. So, which in the bigger monasteries is quite the event. So there's usually a good extra amount of activities and people coming to the monastery. Different observances that the lay people take on voluntarily and the monks are compelled to observe. They need to do meet together, the bhikkhus, and recite their rule summary, and then the novices and anagarikas, who are 8 precept holders in training, also redetermine their devotion to precepts. Then there's usually a Dhamma talk, usually one for the monks, after they have their Uposatha meeting focused on the monastic discipline. And then after meditation and chanting in the evening, usually there's a Dhamma talk, which is these days from our home monastery of Baigiri, is streamed live on YouTube. So I checked in on that last night, and Ajahn Yanako was giving a Dhamma talk from a Baigiri. And then that's followed by a all-night sit in many of the monasteries. Some practice that Ajahn Chah was fond of, or found use in, and it became a very regular part of his monastic schedule and monastic training in his monasteries. Difficult practice to keep up. Some of the communities don't sit all through the night. In fact, I think most of the communities in the West don't have a compulsory all-night sit, but sit until either midnight or 3 or 3:30 in the morning when they do morning chanting, and then people can continue sitting or take a bit of a break. Thinking a bit about identity and its relationship to suffering. It seems increasingly that people are drawn to and making much of their identities. And in terms of reducing suffering, I think it's a dangerous sort of drift. And it's interesting to reflect on the Buddha himself. Like yesterday, there was a bit of a question about the Buddha and Buddhas. But what is in a name? Like when I think of the Buddha, I mean, I definitely think of him in a few different ways. Like one, he was a human having a human experience, but someone who had, through multiple lifetimes, developed enormous good karma and spiritual perfections to be able to awaken to the truth of suffering, its causes, and its cessation. And then able to inspire faith in others that they too could not just develop in wholesome qualities and skillfulness, but they too could understand dukkha, its roots, its cessation, and practice developing that in themselves. And if you look carefully at the text, we talk about the bodhisattva, which is the Buddha to be, and then post-enlightenment, the Buddha most often refers to himself and is referred to as the Buddha or the Tathagata. And all these years later, we think of the Buddha as we think of everybody, through some frame of identity and personality. Or we think of him as a man who lived in India or northern India so long ago. But after his insight into the Four Noble Truths, he refers to himself in two very strange ways. One is the awakened one. So he doesn't go by his given name anymore, or even refer to his clan. He's the Buddha. He's merely the awakened one. Alternately, the Tathagata, which is a term somewhat where there's a little bit of controversy or ambiguity about whether it means the thus come one or thus gone Tathagata. Very strange. Not really a name so much. And part of the reasoning, I think, in naming oneself as such is integral to this process of overcoming suffering is understanding the limitation of self, the limitation of worldly designations, the limitation of identity, any identity at all. Ajahn Chah spoke about this in a way that I think guards against this being just some abstract or abstruse kind of metaphysical teaching, or even divorced from the practical realities of living in the world. As knowing, like, the not being confused about the kind of worldly designations, such as a given name or an identity, but knowing the limitations of those and knowing how they're ultimately empty of essence and not really who we are. So, like, not being confused or deluded, making too much out of the worldly sort of truth that I'm a man born in America, born in this time and place, and the limitations that come with that, and more importantly, how those identities and holding to them sows the seeds of suffering. And understanding the limitation of that and the deeper sort of truth of how that is not who I really am, or the relationship between just framing our conscious experience in those ways to suffering. That's what it's really getting at. And by constantly not having the knowledge of the deeper sort of truth of selflessness, one is kind of stuck in always conceiving of oneself as bound by some sort of identity, constantly comparing ourselves to others, constantly identifying with what are essentially more temporal and superficial ways of identity. If you take a broader sort of scope and look at Buddhist cosmology, we've been all kinds of things. We've been men, we've been women, we've been animals, we've been devas, maybe asuras. And to really get beyond, to go beyond sort of suffering, one needs to realize the limitation of constantly framing our experience in that way. Partially because this habit of these identities is so bound up with the pull to try to find happiness and satisfaction in the world. When there's a me, there's a for me. When there's a me, there's a mine. And the orientation of self is to find happiness in being and becoming, satisfaction and completion in being and becoming. And the whole misguided sort of chase of trying to find happiness and completion, satisfaction somewhere out there. Me happy somewhere out there in the future. Somewhat different than what is. And the direction of the Dhamma is turning away from that, questioning that, seeing the limitation of that, seeing dukkha in that, how that is unsatisfactory, and turning towards the more present and lucid experience of consciousness that is free from craving, free from selfing, free from identity. Dukkha does not cease for us out there. Dukkha ceases right here in this very mind and body with the arising of clear knowledge and insight. An integral part of that knowledge and insight is the falling away of false notions of selfhood. And not being skilled in that, we're not really able to see the Buddha. You know, we have this lacking that kind of knowledge and wisdom that the Buddha talks about as empowering one to go beyond suffering, we are very much stuck in the habit of seeing beings through identity. There's this very strong sense to anthropomorphize everything. Even looking at clouds, you see human shapes and beings. Even thinking about gods and demons, we conceive of them as being like us. And the Buddha says, one who sees the Dhamma sees me. So one really needs to see the Dhamma, like clearly, to realize the Dhamma, to know the Buddha. He who sees the Dhamma sees me. He who sees me sees the Dhamma. But, when we think about the Buddha, we think about, and we see him through the taint of self, through the taint of identity. And the Buddha discouraged people from making images of him, and that lasted a few hundred years. Maybe. We don't know for sure. But he didn't even want all these images that we find in the world made of him. And I think probably because it just reinforces this very misguided notion of thinking of the Buddha as a person, as a man. And that's not the Buddha. The Buddha is that which is gone beyond. With knowledge and wisdom, that which sees beyond identity to the deeper reality. Could you recommend a guide or resource on how to meditate the way you do it in your tradition? How did you get started with meditation? Well, there is no one way that we meditate, either in the monastery that I ordained in or live in, and even the Ajahn Chah tradition or the Theravadan tradition. There is no one way. So there are ways, and I could recommend a couple different guides. One that I think is very accessible is couple short videos on breath meditation that Ajahn Sona did a few years ago on his YouTube channel. So that's a very nice introduction to breath meditation, which is one of the primary forms of meditation. There's also two books that Ajahn Sucitto made on meditation that I think are quite nice. One is like just a very short book. So it's called something like Meditation for Busy People. Ajahn Sucitto. And then there's a longer book, which I think is just called Meditation. So it's a yellow cover, it's spiral bound book. Those can be found on forestpublications.org. So those are good guides that I can recommend to people. But there is no sort of one way. There's several translated talks of Ajahn Chah's where he often begins his talk with the encouragement for people to establish themselves in meditation. And one can get a basic sense of how it is that he would often sort of teach or encourage people to focus the mind. And primarily, his encouragement would be to establish mindfulness of the breath. And he would encourage people to do that at the beginning of a reflection that he would offer, or a Dhamma talk. So we'd just encourage people to settle their mind and establish it in meditation on the breath as he would begin a Dhamma talk. And then he would also sort of say, don't worry too much about what I'm saying. Just focus your mind in this way and let the talk sort of just wash past you. And that which is useful and relevant to you will grab a hold of your attention, but ground yourself in mindfulness. And he would teach meditation as a way to do that for listening to a Dhamma talk that he gave. So you could look to some of the Ajahn Chah talks. I don't know that anyone's ever collected a little or made a little collection of those just as a Ajahn Chah on meditation. But it's been many years since I've looked at that stuff. So how did I get started? Mostly through yoga practice. I had a teacher that taught breath meditation, and that was my initial entry into meditation. And then later connected with the practice of anapanasati, or breath meditation, through the Theravadan tradition. And that was greatly helped by spending some time at Ajahn Buddhadasa's monastery in Thailand, where they taught retreats in English once a month, and you could live in the monastery for a period of time. So before I was a monk, I spent some time there and learned more formally anapanasati, or breath meditation. And let's see, there's a follow-up to your question, Eleanor. What helped? Well, what helped was faith that it was a worthy endeavor and worth giving a serious effort to, and good instruction, and an environment that allowed me to really pursue it deeply. And for me, the difficulties early on were not having a teacher, or not having that sort of support of the environment. And I would say a clear sense of what I was doing. So I found the teaching on anapanasati very useful, because it gives such a kind of clear framework for how to apply effort. Chapter 13 of the Dhammapada, the world, speaks of psychic powers. Can you explain the meaning? Yeah, there's a list of supernormal powers that are listed in the Pali Canon. It's not something that I give much attention or focus to, so it's hard for me to remember the whole list of them. But one is a deep and clear understanding of karma. Like, this is not something that one can normally understand, and it's bound up with and often supported by an understanding of previous lives. So those are psychic powers. And then there's the more common, sort of the ability to know the mind of another. The ability to converse with beings in other realms. There's a whole bunch. There's some fairly canonical list which pops up again and again, but there is talk of and teachings connected with the development of psychic powers, and the basis of those essentially is mastery over jhanas, although just the attainment of jhana doesn't necessarily develop psychic powers. So, and many of the monks in Thailand that are a bit more focused on this, if you ask them, they tend to credit the arising of psychic powers to accumulated spiritual perfections or karma from previous lives. So, but one of my early teachers, Ajahn Buddhadasa, he famously kind of discouraged interest in psychic powers and said if you're really interested in enlightenment, you need to focus on that and not be hankering after or overly interested in the development of such aptitudes. And I was sufficiently persuaded by that it's never really been too much of an interest. It was a curiosity early on, but I find the challenge of just trying to be a skillful person and understand and overcome dukkha enough. Now, from the Theravada perspective, some of these psychic powers can help, especially knowledge of karma and the knowledge of previous lives. So some of the passages in the suttas where they're talking about the Buddha's awakening experience goes into that as well. Good morning, Haley. In the chant Reflections on Sharing Blessings, there's a line, "The solitary Buddha is my noble Lord," which I think now has been changed to "my noble guide." The solitary Buddha is my noble guide. Does solitary here refer to the Paccekabuddha? Yes. Yeah, the answer is yes. So that is the Paccekabuddha that I was speaking about yesterday. Could you please give a reframe for one of the early chapters in Atomic Habits where the author says that identity is key to changing habits? I think I'd have to go back and look at that. But just, reflecting on it, identity has a lot to do with our habits and our inability to overcome habits. This notion of who we are and the habits of self carry a lot of limitations with them, and one of them is we tell ourselves, that's not me, I'm not capable of that. And the truth is you don't know what you're capable of. And it's a serious obstacle to developing something or realizing something if part of your identity is that that's not something that you can develop or you can achieve or attain. It's part of the reason why identity is so dangerous and so limiting. Good morning, Shamina Senrate. So good morning, friends. Oh, what did I just do? Good news, my sister-in-law is donating her stem cells today so my brother-in-law can receive them tomorrow. Will you join me in sending them metta and good vibes for their success? Yes, I'll join you, and I encourage everyone else to. Would you agree that we need a functional identity in the world until we are enlightened? Well, it depends what you mean by functional identity. I mean, identity and a sense of self is a natural part of consciousness. And the Buddha isn't encouraging you just to brainwash yourself into thinking that you have no self. It's a really pointing to an examination of self as a feature of consciousness that arises and ceases, and to investigate its relationship to the processes of suffering. So, and as we engage in that, there's the ability to sort of see that the sense of self arises and passes away, and see it for what it is. The problem is we have all kinds of notions of self that arise and cease, but through attachment and through a lack of a deeper understanding of it, we carry these around and we take refuge in them in a way that supports the experience of dukkha. So, Ajahn Chah talked about there being no Ajahn Chah. Like, people can say Ajahn Chah, that's not really who he is, but he's also not confused when people come into the monastery and say, "Are you Ajahn Chah?" He's not perplexed as to what they're talking about. He understands the conventional, that the conventional functionality of having name, and as well as the limitation of that. So I think where people go wrong is they hold it as a belief. Like, if they're convinced in a religious way of non-self, then and are merely holding to it rather than actually doing the work of purifying the mind and examining the conscious experience of all the forms of self that arise and cease in consciousness and their relationship to suffering. If it's just mere view or opinion, it may even do more harm than good. The thing that troubles me about that question, though, sometimes is there's a whole defense of the self and of identity that people oftentimes mount, and a whole bunch of proliferation and doubt about developing a self before you transcend a self that, might have some value in it, but it's a little misaligned with the teachings of non-self as they sit in the Theravadan canon, which is really the way I interpret it is it's a pointing out, like the Buddha is saying, examine this tendency to frame your experience through self, examine your assumptions of who it is that you think you are, and in particular, sort of look at how that relates to the experience of dukkha. Look at the relationship of that to tanha, to thirsting and craving that leads to dukkha. Okay, friends, I'll leave it at that for today. Thank you for joining me. Hope everybody is well. And we'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.